Erin. How are
Hey,
you today?
good. How are you doing?
All right. Something came through my news feed yesterday, and I did a little research into it. I don't know if you've heard about this, but the rules for the 117th Congress, which are the rules that the House of Representatives will follow when the administration turns over later this month, have been written, and they're being put forth for a vote when the House comes into session next. It's a 45-page document, but there were a couple of things that caught my attention and really concerned me. Right at the beginning of the document, it says, adopting the rules of the House of Representatives for the 117th Congress, comma, and for other purposes. We can come back to that in a minute, but these are the rules for the House of Representatives and for other purposes. And that's pretty vague and a little bit concerning. That sounds a little ominous to me. But when you go down to page 5, now they're taking the last set of rules that apply to the 116th Congress, and they're making changes to them. And this is normal. This happens, I think, every time there's a change of administration. A lot of it's like remove this comma and put a semicolon, change from manager to supervisor. It's a lot of stuff like that. But this particular section is really troublesome. Gender inclusive language. This starts on line 20 of page 5. In clause 8C3 of Rule 23, strike father, mother, son, daughter, brother, sister, uncle, aunt, first cousin, nephew, niece, husband, wife, father-in-law, mother-in-law, son-in-law, daughter-in-law, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, stepfather, stepmother, stepson, stepdaughter, stepbrother. Moving on to page 6, stepsister, half-brother, half-sister, grandson or granddaughter. Those are all being stricken. No more
Wow.
words of those. Here's what's being replaced. And insert parent, child, sibling, parent's sibling, first cousin, sibling's child, spouse, parent-in-law, child-in-law, sibling-in-law, step-parent, stepchild, step-sibling, half-sibling, or grandchild. And
Wow.
similarly, a little later on, they're striking all of those same familial relationship words and putting in language that doesn't indicate the sex of the person involved.
Wow. And
What
this
do
is
you think?
supposed to be inclusive, and yet to me, what it indicates is an exclusion of something that is very near and dear to many of us, which is our identity as mother, sister, wife, daughter. These are all very important part of who we are. And now they're saying, no, we're not allowed to use those identifiers. Instead, we have to use these gender neutral identifiers, which actually are confusing because it's much harder to know who you're talking about if you just talk about a child than if you talk about a daughter.
Mhm. Yeah, and these words, these familial relationships, they're historical. They've been used for hundreds and hundreds of years. Further back than that, we've always had sex delineated language. And you're right. If I tell you, oh, my parent is ill, oh, which parent? My parent, which
With the
has
frontal.
the large sex gametes.
Right.
If
I
I'm
know.
not if I'm not allowed to use female, male, mother, father, how do I express myself?
Right. Well, not only that, but it's concerning as far as the other purposes, what other purposes it might be, because if this starts bleeding into public health and we're no longer allowed to use those sex designators for collecting data about our population, that could have huge ramifications for us in identifying criminal issues, in identifying public health needs. All of these, we collect data based on sex identifiers because they matter.
And we do that so that we can make laws which actually deal with crime, so that we can put policy in place that is actually effective. For example, we know that 98% of violent crime is committed by men. Um, Now, the way men are being allowed to self identify as women that data is being corrupted.
Mhm.
Because if you look at what's being written about in the media has also adopted a style guide based upon the transgender activists' demands that if a person identifies as female, you must call her she. So we're reading these confusing news stories about she raped the woman. Like, how does one woman rape another woman? There was a case where in court, a woman was forced to refer to her rapist by the pronoun she. And this is a man with a penis who raped her violently. And the judge tells this woman in court, no, you have to refer to her as she. So it's making women now look like we are committing more violent crimes, and we're not. We are not committing any more crimes than we ever have.
Right. Wow. And it really is disturbing because fundamentally what it is it's a corruption of our language. And
Mhm.
so it's bigger than just about sex-based identifiers. It's about a whole movement to corrupt our language and to make it increasingly difficult to talk about things that are important to talk about, such as the fact that men have a higher rate of violent crime against women. Those are things that are important to talk about. But if the language gets corrupted, then it's really hard to talk about these things anymore.
Well, George Orwell warned us about this, didn't he?
I
In
did.
his book 1984, he said, I quote, "Don't you see that the whole aim of newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it."
Wow.
That is scary. This
That is
is a
very scary.
perfect example of newspeak. I don't think anyone has ever used the term child in law or parent in law. I've never heard those words before.
No. And typically I don't talk about my sibling, I talk about my brother. And I don't talk about my child, I talk about my son or my daughter. And so these are important ways for us to identify people as I mean they're to me it's sort of like a very important structure within our language that's being taken away. And I have a
Mhm.
feeling that some people will say, hey, it's no big deal. We're just trying to be gender inclusive, which is the line that we hear over and over and over again, that we're overreacting, that this really isn't a big deal. And yet, this is how, as Orwell well pointed out, gradually we erase something that is very important to us, which is our sex. And those identifiers, which are based on sex, get erased, which means that somebody's feelings then are going to override the rights and protections of others.
Well, and this to me is very similar. It's identical to what the school systems have been doing. My district slipped two little words, gender identity, into their non-discrimination clause in, I believe it was 2015. And it's like, oh, that's no big deal. We're just being kind. We're just being inclusive. So we're just going to put gender identity in with race and religion and sexual orientation. No big deal. But what that did was open up the doors for all of these policies that undermine girls and women. Um, no longer have sex segregated sports because we don't identify sex anymore. It's now all about gender identity. No longer have private bathrooms because we don't recognize sex anymore. It's all gender identity. So I'm going to play devil's advocate with you for a second. Some people might say, oh, but these are just the House of Representatives rules. It's just for what they do in the House of Representatives. It's not a big deal. What would you say to that?
Well, it starts to become a big deal when you start talking about Title IX and when you start talking about legislation that protects women and girls, and when you start talking about legislation that talks about LGBT rights. Because if you don't have these sex identifiers, then you really don't have LGBT rights anymore, because
Mhm.
those identifiers signify same sex attraction. And if you don't have if you don't have a word for that sexual attraction anymore, then that's gone. And so it makes it, like you said, it might just be in the House of Representatives, but first of all, they have a huge amount of control, and they start to influence the language within our communities. And so it is a big deal. And again, it's that insidious little, like, just a little erosion of our understanding of sex, just gradually. They just gradually do it a little bit more, a little bit more. And before you know it, teachers aren't going to be allowed to refer to children as boys and girls, because there's going to be some federal mandate that says that we can't have those sex identifiers in school. And soon you're going to have prisons not be able to segregate males and females, because you're going to have a federal mandate that says we can't talk about male prisoners and female prisoners. We can just talk about prisoners. So it is problematic. It might just be one little rule change and a little bit of a shift in the language, but it's actually a very profound shift. It would be kind of, in my mind, tantamount to saying we will no longer talk about indigenous people versus white people versus black people. We will only talk about people.
Mm.
It would erase those important designations for people that provide them with rights and protections, and also help us to provide community health programs, policing programs, schooling programs, sports programs. I mean, all these things are based on these identifiers.
Mhm. Well, that's a really great point. And when I go back to the very beginning of the document again, where it introduces itself as adopting the rules of the House of Representatives for the 117th Congress, comma, and for other purposes.
And what are those? I mean, are we going to have to get rid of Mother's Day and Father's Day and just have Parents' Day?
That's a really good question. Some people might think that that's a little bit hyperbolic, but I don't think it is,
No.
because we have seen that this is the goal of the trans rights movement, is to obliterate all sense of sex, that there's no such thing as a man, there's no such thing as a woman. Um, Now, there's a lot there that is kind of undermines itself when they're presenting their spectrum of, the Barbie doll and the GI Joe. Well, if there's no such thing as, male and female, then
How do
why do you
people
have,
determine what they are?
right?
But what I also see happening is potentially birth certificates having just parent one, parent two. And again, that's going to influence the data collection. That's important. If we just designate someone as a parent rather than a mother and father, it also, I take it very personally as someone who, for me, motherhood was very important. It was something that it really shaped me as a person. It means a lot to me. And they're taking that away from me and saying, no, you're no longer a mother. You're just a parent. You're a generic parent. And again, it's that taking away of, it's ironic because in that document, much of it was focused on diversity and inclusion, the new rules committee, and how we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion. And it's ironic to me that as part of diversity and inclusion, what they're actually doing is getting rid of important diversity.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. It's not inclusive to tell a woman that she can't be referred to as a mother. It's not diverse to tell a man that he can't be included, he can't be referred to as a father. It is, it's stripping us of layers of meaning, of historical um, underpinnings. I really look at this as just an out and out attack on the family.
Mhm.
If I can't look at a family and say, this is mother, this is father, this is son, this is daughter, if I can't say that, what is a family?
Yeah.
Really, at its heart, what is a family?
Yeah, it becomes more just people who happen to be living together. I
Mhm.
mean,
We're all just roommates.
we're all just roommates, right? And it really does then start to undermine parental authority if we're just all just sort of people in this world. Again, and I'm seeing this with children too. There's this move to even remove the concept of child, and we talk about them as young people rather than children, because again, we're trying to, it really strikes me that we're trying to put put everybody in this, so that we're all generic, that we're not able to separate each other. And this is dangerous for women, especially because one of the reasons that we have designations is to help us stay safe. That we recognize these differences in male and female because they're important, and because they help us keep ourselves safe. And what this is doing is suggesting that if we use this kind of language, we're somehow intolerant or bigoted, or we're not tolerant of diversity. And so it's doing is it's shifting this kind of label of someone who's intolerant and someone who isn't interested in diversity, and putting it on the person who actually wants to maintain the diversity. So it's very confusing.
It is. It is. This might be a little tangential, but I was just thinking about what we taught our kids about safety.
Mhm.
And this was part of what I was taught. This is part of what was in child rearing books as I was raising my kids, is about if a child is lost and needs help, who are the safe people to go to? Look for somebody in uniform. Uniform people are usually safe. Look for a mother. That
Mhm.
was always one of the safe people to go to. Look for a mother with children.
Mhm.
Why is that? Because women are recognized to be less likely to commit violent crimes than men. That's factual. I'm sorry if it hurts men's feelings,
Yeah.
but it's true. And that's what we teach our kids. If I'm not allowed to designate the difference between a mother and a father, how do I tell my child who to go to if
You
they're
have
if
to
they're
rely
lost?
on really rigid stereotypes. I mean, that's what's so ironic about this, is that in order to then describe someone who's female, we have to resort to basically stereotypes, and hope that the people who your child recognizes with these stereotypes is actually a woman. And these days they may not be,
Mhm.
because trans people tend to embrace those rigid stereotypes. So it really is very convoluted. And I'm just trying to think of the ramifications of all the different areas that this will bleed into. Bathrooms. So if we don't have girls and boys and we just have children, or we don't have men and women, we just have people. So then we can get rid of sex segregated bathrooms and locker rooms and overnight facilities. Sporting events, we no longer need to have girls and boys sporting events and men and women's sporting events. We can just have people's sporting events. So we don't need to have those designations anymore. Prisons, as we mentioned, what I see is this, this little tiny snowball that's starting at the top of the hill, and everybody's sort of looking at it saying, oh, it's no big deal. It's just really small. You don't really need to worry about that. And they're not seeing how it's just going to roll and get bigger and bigger and bigger, and all the different areas it's going to influence in our society. And again, for me, it's also just an insult to us as people that the Congress somehow feels like it's within their rights to just erase these sex designations, that somehow that they have a right to do that. I don't understand how they feel that that's in the best interests of the American people, much less that this is just something they can just interject into the rules. And to me, that's the thing, that's the crux of it. They're just sort of sneaking it in.
Mhm. Yeah, and it also it I can see the ethos behind it. Well, if we don't differentiate between people, then everybody will be just one happy community. Um, but we know that that's not the way it is. We know that's not the way it is. People are different. Men and women are very different. If you have ever lived with, worked with, communicated with somebody of the opposite sex, you know we are very different. We have different needs.
Mhm.
And by lumping everybody together, it's actually suggesting that there's something wrong with
Mhm.
one or the other. There's either something wrong with men that we need to take away the categorization men, or there's something wrong with women that we need to take away that categorization. It's not diverse at all. It's actually quite the opposite. It's telling people it's wrong to be a man, it's wrong to be a woman. You don't want to be that. You just want to be this generic thing that's just like everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah, it just makes me think about, I think about Congress and all the different groups that testify. You have Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Are they going to have to now be parents against drunk driving? I mean, you think about all the way that these implications and how rigidly is Congress going to enforce these rules? If, just the fact that they feel like they have to, codify this, that they're not going to allow people to have a choice about this. They're actually going to codify this into the rules. To me, that's where it's sort of I feel like people talk about a slippery slope, and I feel like we're on a cliff just barely hanging on, and someone's stomping on our fingers. Because if we let go, the end result just looks so disastrous. And then I know people will again say this is hyperbolic, but I think if you look at where things have gone in the last couple of years, nobody thought that there would be arguments that men should be put into women's prisons just because they say they're a woman. Nobody ever thought that would be the case. Nobody ever thought that there would be men who would be competing against women in women's sports, or let alone high school girls. Nobody ever thought that there would be boys who would say I'm a girl and therefore be able to go into the girls' locker room. Nobody ever thought that there would be boys who would be allowed to spend the night with high school girls on overnight trips and their parents not know about it because that boy identifies as a girl. And so when I see what's happening, and it's happened so fast, I feel like this is a push, and they're trying to do it very subtly and gradually, and then they can look around and say, well, it's all legal.
Mhm. Well, that's what happened in the schools too. When the district started slipping gender identity into the policy, then, a year, 2 years later, they start introducing these transgender student policies, which enable all the things we just talked about. Boys to play on girls' sports teams, boys to sleep in girls' hotel rooms on overnight trips, boys to use girls' bathrooms. And parents raise their hands and go, wait, that's not okay. And the school board goes, it's been in the policy for years.
Right.
Why are you complaining? You should have complained before it was put in the policy. And so I think that's what we need to do right now. We need to complain
Yeah. And,
before
and
this
I
is
also
put
think we
in.
need to be aware of other areas where this is going to sort of keep happening. So the Equality Act, the president-elect has said that one of his goals is to get that passed within the first 100 days. And again, that's another one of these insidious little policies that it sounds so nice. The Equality Act, of course, we want everybody to be treated equally. And people not realizing that the Equality Act is going to erase the concept of sex-based identities, which means that women's, girls, and LGBT rights are going to be compromised because those are based on our sex.
Right. The heart of the so-called Equality Act is taking the word sex out
Mhm.
and replacing it with gender identity.
Mhm.
So anybody can say, he or she can say, I am the opposite sex, and nobody is allowed to question that.
Right.
And what we're seeing, even lesbians, I've talked to several friends who are lesbians, they don't have bars anymore. They don't have gathering places because men are saying that they are women
Mhm.
and going into those places which have historically been for women and taking over the place. This is heartbreaking, but I've heard personal stories of lesbians meeting someone that they thought was another woman, and then they are raped by that person who was a man later that evening. So lesbians are scared to go
Yeah.
into places that were historically for them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's infuriating. And I don't mean to be, over here, trying to incite panic. But I do think people really need to take this seriously. That, these are important. As I said, these are important designations. Somebody's gender identity might be important to them, but my identity as a daughter, as a sister, as a mother, as potentially a grandmother one day, as a niece, as an aunt, those are all incredibly important designations. And for them to presume that somebody's sex identity, their gender identity, something that they're just choosing is somehow more important than all of these other designations is just really suggesting that their rights are more important than the rest of us.
Yeah. And the what's the word I'm looking for? what they're saying is that those of us who find it important that my gender, my sex is important to me, like you said, that I'm a wife, I'm a daughter, I'm a mother, to say that makes me bigoted.
Mhm.
This is what I'm told.
Yeah.
To consider it important that I am a female makes me bigoted against who? I don't know, against people who don't want to be the sex that they were born to be.
And the other
And
thing is that we are mothers and daughters and wives and sisters. And so our designations, which are founded in biology, are being erased, while people's identity, which is based in nothing other than feelings, is being emboldened.
yeah, it's being codified. I wonder what would happen if if these rules are put into place. Because now, if a person goes to testify and they say, my pronoun is wa. Oh, okay. Well, we all have to call you wa because you said that's your pronoun.
Yeah.
If I go in and I say, I am mother,
Mhm.
and I want to be called mother because that's my pronoun. That's what I want to be called. What will happen? I'll
Yeah.
probably go to jail. I'll probably go
They'll
to jail
insist
for.
on calling you parent, even though, and that's certain people's feelings are being privileged over basic rights of ours, and that's where I think it's concerning, that if there was like a demand for somebody to be called something based on reality, based on biology, based on some kind of something that could be measured and confirmed, then that's one thing. But gender identity is based completely on somebody's feelings, and there's no way to even verify it, so people can lie about it. And that to me is again concerning, that people get to lie about their identity, whereas their true identity, things that are based in fact, is being erased. And in this case, it really is, it's not hyperbolic to say it's being erased. They're replacing mother and father with parent. They're replacing sister and brother with sibling. These sex identifiers are being erased.
What do we as concerned citizens need to do about this?
Well, I think it's really important that we stand up for truth. And if this is something that concerns you, contact your legislator and tell them that you don't want to be erased, that your sex identifiers are important, and insist that they change the language, because this hasn't been approved yet. We still have time to address this. And this is something that hopefully our Congress members will be receptive to, especially if we can explain our concerns. What about you,
I
Maria?
want,
Do you have any thoughts?
yeah, I agree. I agree with you. I think we need to let our voices be heard. And if we find this unacceptable, we need to tell our congressman that. I often wonder how much of this kind of slips in without everyone on the floor knowing what's happening.
Yeah.
Because I know there's a ridiculous amount of paper that goes across congressmen's desks, and they don't always have time to read all of it. So giving them the benefit of the doubt, I'm going to give my Congress people the benefit of the doubt that they don't know that this is happening. And
Right.
I'm going to let them know that this is
And I
happening.
think that is a really good point, because I have talked with members of Congress, and oftentimes they just get handed a brief. And
Mhm.
if somebody doesn't specifically point out a concern to them, they just go with it. And in this case, especially when it's just the House rules, of course they're not going to change too much. Most of the time, I think members are probably not going to read it that carefully. So bringing it to the attention of not only of your Congress members, but also the media. If you can maybe contact your media and say, hey, what's going on with the House rules? Why are they trying to get rid of these sex identifiers? I think that might be effective too, so that we can get some media coverage on, what is the motivation behind this? Let them justify this rather than just slip it through.
And also letting people on the ground know, let your friends know that this is happening. The more people that push back on it, the more likely we are to stop this from going.
Well, thank you, Maria, for bringing it up. I think I'm hoping that people will respond to this and realizing how dangerous it is. I think that Orwell really pointed out how important language is, and how insidious it is when people start to manipulate the populace with the language.